All right. So the next section, our last section, we talked about about U.S. slavery, and then the 250 years of slavery, and we ended with the Civil War, and everything, slavery was ended, but there was really, no services, or no nothing for nearly free Black people, and that takes us to their next section, which is basically, which is about the Reconstruction era, or ultimately the overthrow of the Reconstruction era. And this is such an important time period that we do not teach. I went to this conference for high school historians a couple years ago. It was around Reconstruction, and they asked everyone who had heard about Reconstruction in their while growing up in high school, and like very few people raised their hands. This is like an auditorium of like 200 history teachers, and then they asked who thought this was the most important time period in our country, and like the majority of people's hands. And I think that's just like telling of this like war on our history. And we're going to talk more about whitewashing history and how we've lost this history. But this is such an important period, and it's a very short period, only about a decade or so. Particularly the important part of what we call radical Reconstruction, but it's such an important part because this was basically our only attempt at fixing fixing the realities left over of slavery. It was our only attempt at things like reparations, and making an egalitarian society for these newly freed Black people. Reconstruction was all about this fight between multiple different parties about what the South should look like moving forward. And ultimately, if this character, this cartoon, it didn't give it away, is ultimately Reconstruction was overthrown by white supremacy and basically returned to the South, returned to the Confederate South. With all new, even though slavery was gone, they've created all new different systems of slavery that continued, slavery and different variations, from convict leasing to sharecropping, to lynching, to all different kinds of things. But for a brief moment, we had this really great time period of where we came close from creating an egalitarian society, and creating close from creating a society that actually was ready to handle the end of slavery, and that was all ultimately dismantled and then whitewashed through our history. But we're going to talk about this, dive a little bit into this in the next section, and then the section after that we'll talk about all the ways slavery was transformed into other systems. But I want to start out again with another equal justice initiative. Great, really amazing cartoon, kind of summarizing Reconstruction, with Brian Stevenson narrate again.
After 2.5 centuries of enslavement in the United States, where Black people were tortured, abused, sexually assaulted, killed, and subjected to forced labor, emancipation finally came at the end of the Civil War with the ratification of the 13th Amendment in 1865. Most formerly enslaved people in the United States were remarkably willing to live peacefully with those who had held them in bondage despite the violence they had suffered and the degradation they endured. Emancipated Black people put aside their enslavement and embraced education, hard work, faith, and citizenship. This period, called Reconstruction, held great hope for America and Black Americans in particular. But the Reconstruction era's initial hope for progress gave way to devastating, deadly violence. Between 1865 and 1876, thousands of Black women, men, and children were attacked, killed, and terrorized by white people who were shielded from arrest and prosecution. During the Memphis Massacre of 1866, white mobs indiscriminately beat, robbed, tortured, shot, raped, and killed Black women, men, and children. In the course of 3 days, 90 Black homes were destroyed, and all Black schools and churches were burned to the ground. Black residents were stripped of their belongings and forced to flee into the woods. There was no criminal prosecution against the white instigators of the Memphis Massacre, one of hundreds of such incidents during this period. The surge of anti-Black violence prompted Congress to approve the first Reconstruction Act in February 1867 to ensure that Black people's equality would be reinforced. In 1868, the 14th Amendment declared all persons born in the country were citizens regardless of race, and thus entitled to privileges of citizenship, due process, and equal protection. Over 80% of eligible Black men registered to vote. Schools for Black children became a priority, and courageous Black leaders overcame enormous obstacles to win elections to public office. This triggered a violent backlash from those within the white community who could not accept Black equality. In Opelousas, Louisiana, in September 1868, white citizens terrorized the community to suppress Black voter turnout in the upcoming election. White mobs roamed the countryside for several weeks, targeting Black citizens and their white allies, murdering an estimated 200 people. Other massacres of hundreds of Black people took place in New Orleans, Colfax, and parishes throughout Louisiana. Violence spread from Texas to North Carolina, where white mobs sought to intimidate and deprive Black people of their rights. Despite being continuously terrorized by their former enslavers, the Black community mobilized throughout the South by organizing meetings, parades, and petitions calling for the implementation of their legal and political rights, including the right to vote. In 1870, the United States ratified the 15th Amendment, explicitly prohibiting racial discrimination in voting. But still, most white people refused to accept Black citizenship. In both the North and the South, there was tremendous resistance to the idea of Black equality. On October 10, 1871, African-American activist and Union Army veteran Octavius Cato left the Philadelphia, Pennsylvania school where he served as a teacher and administrator and headed to the polls to cast his ballot in the city's mayoral election. Mr. Cato successfully cast his vote, but on his way home from the polls, he was assassinated by Frank Kelly, who had ties to white supremacist party leaders and who was later acquitted by an all-white jury. Being attacked or killed on an election day was a common reality for Black citizens. During Reconstruction, an estimated 2,000 Black men served in elected office from local and state positions all the way up to Congress. But increased political participation came at a cost of increased white violence against the Black community. In Vicksburg, Mississippi, in December 1874, where Black people gathered to protest the removal of their elected Black sheriff from office, white mobs attacked and killed at least 50 of them. And then, in 1877, just 12 years after emancipation, the meager progress that was made towards securing equal rights for Black citizens was abandoned when political compromise with Confederate holdouts resulted in the removal of the last federal troops from the South. The commitment to abolish chattel slavery was not accompanied by a commitment to equal rights or equal protection for African Americans, and the hope of Reconstruction quickly became a nightmare of unparalleled violence and oppression. It was during Reconstruction that a century-long era of racial hierarchy, lynching, white supremacy, and bigotry was established, an era from which the nation has yet to recover. 1.5 centuries after the Emancipation Declaration, racial injustice persists in America. EJI presents this report on the tragic period of Reconstruction to describe its implications for the issues we face today. We believe our nation has failed to acknowledge our history of racial terror and that we must commit to a new era of truth-telling, followed by meaningful efforts to repair and remedy the continuing legacy of racial injustice.
I apologize. That was not Brian Stevenson. Tara Taverni that narrated this. Yeah, I love, the thing I love about Equal Justice Initiative, again, it's just like their connection between this time period and the horrific past, things that happened in the past and just how that, directly translates to the, injustices that we're seeing today throughout this time period. And the report she was talking about, they did a couple of amazing reports, but one was about lynching them in America. And if you really will, we're going to have a whole section on white terrorism and lynching during this class, but if it wasn't for the efforts of Equal Justice Initiative, a lot of its history would still be buried. Well, so Reconstruction. So Civil War ends, in April 9th. But right before it ended, so let's kind of just walk through the time period because it was actually multiple stages of Reconstruction. It started out as a presidential Reconstruction that was not so great, and then eventually became this what was called Radical Reconstruction or Republican Reconstruction or Congressional Reconstruction, which we'll talk about on the next slide. But at first, it was presidential Reconstruction. Presidential meaning Andrew Johnson. So when Lincoln was assassinated, this is the man that took over. But essentially, some time period, before the Civil War ended, the 13th Amendment was ratified that essentially outlawed slavery, except as a form of punishment. So this was passed, and then the Civil War ended, which basically allowed this to happen because no one, in the South, could care less about 13th Amendment until it actually lost the war. But you could see the Civil War ended, and then so Lincoln's making all these plans on what he's going to do with the South. I mean, he's really big on his biggest goal is to restore the Union. So he really wants to find ways to gradually bring the Union back. But then just 6 days after the Civil War ended, Lincoln's assassinated and Andrew Johnson took over. And Andrew Johnson, basically, he was brought on the ticket to Lincoln's ticket to help win over Confederate South, or racist, white people in the South, because he was, he's a former, enslaver. He was very pro-Confederate and it was very, anti-black. He did not like the fact that the South seceded, and he actually was very anti-South once they seceded, and made big claims about, holding them responsible. But once he became president, he was mainly looking to actually bring the South back and forgive a lot of these Confederates. So a lot of these Confederate leaders were anticipating being hung for all the things that they'd done, and said Johnson pardons, but over the next year he pardoned 7,000 secessionists. So every Confederate leader who especially people have done horrific atrocities during the Civil War, he pardons them, and basically just restores the governments how they were before before the end of the Civil War. So it's basically just restored all the Confederate governments, and as you can imagine, these Confederate governments, that's what we see is like a wave of violence, right off the bat. We see horrific, they pass what's called black codes, which basically outlaws all different kinds of black lives and forces them to work on sharecropping and conditions that basically mimic how they were in before they were freed. Vagrancy laws, terrorism. We start seeing horrific massacres as Black people are trying to exercise their right to their new freedoms, are just horrifically massacred. We saw in particularly the Memphis massacres, New Orleans massacres, but we should see hundreds of massacres all over the South, and as white terrorism is and these new racist laws are being enforced. And the big thing we saw was he rescinded, Andrew Johnson rescinded Sherman's Field Order 15, which this was like the what we call the 40 acres and a mule. So 40 acres and a mule is essentially, Sherman. So General Sherman, he does the scorching campaign where he goes, to end the Civil War, he goes kind of behind the enemy's lines, and he just, it's like the March to the Sea, and he just like marches through and just burns down plantations and industries and burns down the ability of the South to continue waging war, and it was instrumental on defeating the South. But at the same time, he's burning down all these plantations and stuff. He's freeing all these slaves or enslaved people. A lot of them are following him at his march and are staying under the protection. And this one river he crosses, a lot of them get stuck on behind the river and they get massacred by Confederate soldiers following his arm. So that's when he realizes that he needs to figure out that kind of spurs these conversations about what are we going to do with all these these freed Black people. So he has a meeting with like a big group of Black leaders at the time, and he's like, what is it that you all need to now that you're freed, and what do you need to ensure that freedom? And every one of them was like, we need land. 'Cause that's it. We just need land so we can build our own lives and our own communities. So he actually initiates the order because he's capturing a lot of there's a lot of captured land, especially around the coast around South Carolina, Georgia. There's a lot of captured Confederate land. So he sends an order that essentially gives 400,000 acres of this land. He gives it to 10,000 freedmen. And they for I think for a while, I want to say for like 6 months or so, they were able to take over this land and start start their own farms. And then shortly afterwards, Andrew Johnson, and when he pardons them, he also removes all the all the land claims, and then sends kicks them off, and then gives that land back to the Confederates. There was a small portion of people, black freedom people that were able to, I don't know how, but they were able to actually get deeds to some of the land that was given to somehow, some way. And those people, because they had actual legal deeds, were able to actually keep that land. So a small amount of people were able to keep, some of the land, particularly some of the islands, I think like Hilton Head Island and places like that, and South Carolina islands. But for the most part, like the majority of the 10,000 freedmen had to give their land back. And because, Andrew Johnson basically was advocating this, he wanted to see the return of sharecropping and black codes. He knew how important it was to have, black exploited labor for the South. So he wanted to push black people. He remove the land from them and push them back, and support black codes, which is essentially, made it so black people didn't have any option but to be a sharecropper. They had to go back to these plantations and work for their former slave owners in horrific conditions again, under like debt peonage. So it's very similar to and we'll talk about this later, but on a slide. But it's very similar to like the rise of capitalism in European, Europe in 14, 15, and 1600s. Is that all these upper class and aristocracy and new merchant class, they wanted to create it so people could not they couldn't avoid working in their factories and in their mines and in their large plantations. Like they wanted to prevent any way for black people actually making it on their own. Like they or prevent European peasants. Like they privatized the commons and try to kick them all off their land, and then outlawed vagrancy. Vagrancy laws. The first vagrancy laws came from the rise of capitalism. That basically said you could not work at factories, and they even arrested them and threw them in jail and into workhouses that forced them to work, for free in these factories. So it's very similar circumstances where they passed these black codes that outlawed, vagrancy laws and stuff that basically outlawed black people couldn't only be farmers. They couldn't work in other industries, and then they couldn't, they also had vagrancy codes where they couldn't just not work, or they couldn't, they also, outlawed, black people hunting and trying to survive off of common land. So they're forcing them into sharecropping, and then if they didn't want to, they would be arrested and then forced into convict leasing, which was like where they would arrest black people and then lease them out, to these plantations. So they're trying to create, so Andrew Johnson was on board with the Confederate governments to try to, the previous, Confederate, the new South governments, to try to force black people back into this like exploited land position. So because their entire economy is based on, black exploited labor. So that was the only, they need to continue that. So that's why there's push for this. And that's, and at the same time, the Freedmen Bureau is established around 1865, and this is an organization that Andrew Johnson, opposed in every way possible. He made sure they didn't have funding, but the whole point of Freedmen's Bureau was to try to help newly freed, black people, try to give them, opportunities, economic opportunities. They help build schools, they help with protection, things like that. But he made sure there was no funding for these organs, the Freedmen's Bureau. But one thing they did have is that they were in charge of confiscated Confederate land. So that's why they helped with General Sherman's 40 acres and a mule. And they also kept on pushing for these massive reparations. And they wanted to do land reparations. They wanted to continue this 40 acres and a mule, but they wanted to give 40 acres to every single freedman. in the South. That was their goal. Johnson, fought that as much as he could and prevented that from happening. But that was really like the last, legitimate attempt for reparations for slavery. And it was centered around land reparations. Was the Freedmen's Bureau's attempt to give all newly freed slaves, enslaved people, 40 acres. But so at the time, this with Andrew Johnson back in power and the Confederates back in government and black codes and white terrorism and all these things, it was just horrific for black people. And then we start seeing these huge massacres in Memphis and New Orleans and all these different places, and just violence everywhere. I read that quote, in the last section about one of the emissaries from Johnson, as he went around recording what was happening. It was just recording, just the stench everywhere. There was just dead black people rotting, or being forced to work in horrific situations again, or they had apprenticeship programs we'll talk about later where they forced, black kids, children of black people were forced to work back in plantation owners, and they were even allowed to whip these people and they worked for free. So it was a pretty bad situation, but the news of all this violence was going back to the North, and that really galvanized voters in the North, especially around the 1866 midterm election. So they went to polls and they voted big on support for Republicans, particularly radical Republicans. And it's important to understand Republicans back then are completely opposite Republicans today. And a lot of times, people will try to whitewash that and try to make this connection that, like Trump, I read this really great quote that said, Trump is not, not a son of Lincoln, he's a son of Jefferson Davis. We have to understand around 50s and 60s, the parties, the political parties kind of switched parties, or switched morals. The Republicans at first were very supportive of civil rights. And then it was in the 50s and 60s, it basically, they created a new party around opposing, civil rights, with Barry Goldwater at first, and then eventually, Nixon, George Wallace, all these other people under this new strategy called the Southern Strategy, which we'll have a whole class on that, because that's I think it's just crazy that most people, this party controls most of our government, and we have very little people actually know how it was formed. So we have to understand that the Republican Party in the 50s beyond, modern Republican Party was created in the 50s and 60s, and the modern, same as the Democratic Party, would kind of switch sides. So, but during this time period, that it was the Democrats that opposed civil rights, and the Republicans supported civil rights, which is I don't think I'm being too political when I say that's very that's the opposite of how it is today. So the Republicans, especially particularly the radical Republicans are probably some of the most progressive politicians we've ever had in this country. These are people like Charles Sumner in the Senate, and Thaddeus Stevens in the House. And these people, they were total abolitionists to the point that they wanted to, they were trying to ultimately create an egalitarian society in the South where black people were not only protected but had equal rights across the board. And they passed some of the most important legislation of our country was passed under these people. But so essentially, so they win big in 1866. Suddenly they have a veto-proof majority in both the House and the Senate, and that was basically because the North was just disgusted by what the South was doing after this terrific war that killed 700,000 people, 350,000 or so from the North, and then they just saw Andrew Johnson just hand they're like, what did we fight this for? And because Andrew Johnson literally just handed everything back to the Confederates. So they showed up to the polls, they voted big, and we had this super progressive Republican, party that just controls it. And that's when what we call Congressional or Radical Reconstruction begins, basically the following year in 1867. First thing it follows by, the first thing they do is they pass the Civil Rights Act of 1866. And this is a really powerful Civil Rights Act. Unfortunately, the Supreme Court later dismantled most of it. But it had things, and they had some additions as well. But I mean, it had things that basically all the civil rights acts that we passed in the 60s. It included many things from housing to voting rights and things like that. I mean, it just basically gave Black Americans full citizenship and full equal rights. And of course, Johnson tries to veto this, and then they overrule him. This is actually the first time that Congress actually overrules a veto, presidential veto, and they pass this through. And at the same time, but they realize, that the Southern government's like, yeah, we're never going to respect this, so that's when they pass what's called the Reconstruction Acts of 1867. And the first one is basically they pass this law that basically says that, we're going to reject everything Andrew Johnson does. We're going to, because he was in the process of bringing all these Southern states back into Congress, and he's just like, and so they're like, we're done with this. We're ending, Johnson's, pardons, and what we're going to do is we're going to divide the entire South into 5 military districts governed by military governors. Until each state is willing to actually create an acceptable state constitution that didn't have black codes and didn't have vagrancy laws and actually had equal rights, and included things like the 13th Amendment, and later 14th and 15th Amendment. So what they did is they threw, they just threw away all the governments Johnson was building, and then basically divided everything, the South into 5 districts, and then they redid the elections. They basically, ban, they banned Confederate leaders from participating in elections, and then they gave full access to all males, regardless of race. So they gave, gave Black people the right to vote in this election. So imagine, after the Civil War, suddenly all the Confederate leaders weren't allowed to even participate. They weren't allowed to run for office. They weren't allowed to, vote. And then all the Black people, and then the rest of the, white people, some were supportive and some weren't, were able to vote. And just what we see, is and they were able to vote these governments on the requirement that these governments had to create constitutions that eventually approved the 14th and the 15th Amendment that was passed shortly after. 14th Amendment gave Black people full citizenship, full protection of rights, overturned Dred Scott, the civil rights case that basically said Black people don't deserve rights. And then it gave 15th Amendment granting full access to voting rights. So in order to come back to the, be a state again with representation, they had to create a constitution that was, that respected Black people's rights, and they also had to, approve the 14th and 15th Amendment. So what you get eventually is, because it's just basically, Black people are first time voting, and they vote in huge numbers, along with a lot of, white people on both sides. And you just get a huge, further, probably, I'm pretty sure you get the most Black representation that the South has ever had, up to this point. I mean, they had, 2,000 Black people won offices, including a Black governor, a second Black governor, in the South didn't occur to 1989, so like over a century later. You had people in Congress and state legislation, local offices, sheriffs, police chiefs, Black governors, so you had this enormous amount of Black, participation, and by 1870, Black people held 15% of Southern offices. I mean, and by 1980, a century later, they only had 8%. So they had this enormous amount of, so Black people had, won a lot of office. A lot of, Republican white people won office that wanted to create these egalitarian societies. And then you still had some Democrats winning office as well, but not nearly as much. So, so the South basically was it was probably the most egalitarian it's ever been, to be honest. They did, we're going to talk about, they try to sell this myth, as they're like, overthrowing radical Reconstruction, that all these Black people were corrupt and incompetent, and the Birth of a Nation, was all about how horrible this was. But in reality, this was like, it was amazing government. They did an amazing job. They built the South's first public school system, not just for Black children, but for all children, including white children. Before that, there was no public school system in the South. White children, some of them were sent government to private schools, and then all black children didn't, participate at all. And suddenly, they built an entire public school system. They built roads and hospitals for everyone. They passed all these laws protecting, people, because they were still, they were still recovering from the South. So a lot of people were losing land and couldn't pay taxes. The economy was in shambles. So they're passing all these protections. I mean, it was a very efficient and very amazing government at the time. And so then in 1968, a year later, Ulysses, Grant, it gets elected as president, and he's a big supporter of radical Reconstruction, to the point that he actually passes the enforcement acts, which is basically, because at the time, white people, white Southern, white supremacists and white weren't taking this, lightly. Even though they were in 5 military districts, and all this stuff was being enforced straight by military orders. I mean, military it sent a lot of military down to the South, and they were protecting these new black governments and black people voting away. At the same time, there was this white terrorism that was rising, from KKK and all these other organizations, these terrorist organizations, and they were killing a lot of black people. I mean, this happened a lot, and before, the first year, but military was able to kind of protect a lot of black people during this time period, but a lot of times they weren't able to prosecute a lot of these people, because these state governments, a lot of them, there were still a lot of white supremacists that refused to prosecute a lot of these lynchings and these massacres. So they Grant passed the Enforcement Acts, or the Radical Reconstruction government passed that with Grant, on board. It basically wiped out the KKK for a while. It basically allowed the federal government to go in and prosecute, because when these acts of violence were happening, most of the times they knew who was doing it. They just knew that it was going to be white jurors and white judges, and no one was going to prosecute these people. So most people got away with it. This is the first time that all of a sudden all these white terrorists were being prosecuted and being thrown in jail by the federal government. Like hundreds of KKK members were arrested and tried as criminals and terrorists and thrown in jail. And so you can imagine, I mean, for a brief moment, I mean, this was this amazing society that they were sculpting out the remains of a slaveocracy of the South. So it was a very exciting time period. I mean, there was still, there was corruption, there was, like every other government, and there was, violence, and there was, from the white, terrorists. I mean, it wasn't a perfect time period, and it was a lot, but it was very promising at the same time. And then eventually, honestly, it only lasts till 1877. So if we look at, actual radical Reconstruction is about a decade long, but they do enormous amount of good during that decade. But eventually, they get overthrown. A lot of times, we always teach us, and I'm guilty as well. When I was looking back at my past slides, we always teach us as the failure of Reconstruction, and that's really important to kind of get away from that, because Reconstruction did not fail. Reconstruction was a very successful, decade that created this amazing egalitarian society out of something of a country that was literally, for the last 250 years, a slaveocracy. They did amazing amount, but it was overthrown. It wasn't failed, and we have to get past that, because when you read, if you Google Reconstruction, it always says, "Oh, the failure of Reconstruction." That's very purposeful, and we'll talk about that in a second. Because we're trying, the people trying to whitewash this history, trying to make it seem like it was black people were corrupt and incompetent, and they ultimately failed themselves. When in reality, it's completely opposite. So I'm gonna read this Equal Justice Initiative. This is from that report, Lynching in America. It said, as civil wars end, black autonomy expanded, but white supremacy remained deeply rooted. The failure to unroot these roots would leave black Americans exposed to terrorism and racial subordination for more than a century. So essentially, the biggest thing that happened is just the return of white supremacy. Was terrorism and voter suppression. So even though, so for a while, Grant, and with an enforcement acts, and there was multiple enforcement acts. Even like the last one was like I think it was called like an Anti-Klan Act or something like that. And so they're doing really well prosecuting and tearing down white terrorism. But all of a sudden, there's this big massacre in Colfax, Louisiana, where like a bunch of black people get massacred, and so the government, U.S. government goes in. They want to prosecute. They know exactly who did it. They want to prosecute them, but then one of the people sues the courts, and it gets kicked to the Supreme Court, and Supreme Court essentially decides. and this, you have to understand, the Supreme Court at this time was full of like basically white supremacists. They decide that that only states can prosecute. The Enforcement Acts was only good at at prosecuting state violence. It was not allowed to prosecute individual violence. That fell upon the states, which is still, even though there was all these gains in black politicians, there was still a lot of white judges and a lot of white people, white supremacists that refused to prosecute it. So basically, the Supreme Court said that you told the federal government they can't prosecute, white terrorists anymore, and that basically, from there, just blows up, and white terrorism just blows up at this point, and just starts, just gets bigger and bigger as the federal government's unable to actually do anything about it. And so at that point, we start seeing some massive voter suppression. We see a lot of violence around black voters, a lot of violence around like white Republican voters. And we start seeing, the Democrats at the time, there was a faction that was called the Redeemers, because they were trying to push this idea that, they were the real victims, and these black governments and these Republican governments were actually pressing them and destroying the glory of the South, and so they wanted to redeem the South by in any means necessary. So they worked hand in hand with the white terrorism, suppressing the vote, and then also, getting more Democrats on board, elected. And even as, by 1874, you see the Democrats when they regain the House of Representatives. So they start regaining more of the Congress, and then the radical Republicans start losing. They lose their majority, and they become less and less powerful. And then really, it's really the Supreme Court that really initiates the dismantling of a lot of this. Not only with the United States, the court case that prevents the federal government from prosecuting white terrorists, but they also a whole bunch of series of cases, slaughterhouse cases, is basically they decide that civil rights protections comes from states, not federal governments, which ultimately dismantles, big portions of the Civil Rights Act and the 14th Amendment. The federal government all of a sudden can't enforce these. It's up to the states, and the states are slowly becoming Democrat again, so they're not enforcing this. Then you have, the right to vote could not be, it's another case where it says the right to vote could not be federally protected. So that's, they start dismantling that 15th Amendment, saying the federal government can't protect the right to vote. Only states, and they know exactly what that means when they say only states. They know that that means that white terrorism is going to, be able to successfully, suppress the black vote. And we talked about the Cruikshank, case, and then we start having all these cases about, legalizing segregation and dismantling, which is big components of Civil Rights Act and 14th Amendment, was that they couldn't be segregated. They had legal rights, and all that's being dismantled. Ultimately with the Plessy versus Ferguson, where they it basically just write a framework of how every state can, initiate segregation or Jim Crow. So Carol Anderson writes in White Rage, the U.S. Supreme Court, however, stepped in and succeeded where Johnson had failed. Frederick Douglass lamented that by the time the justices had finished in most of the southern states, the 14th and 15th Amendments were virtually nullified. The rights which they were intended to guarantee are denied and held in contempt. The citizenship granted in the 14th Amendment is practically a mockery, and the right to vote is literally stamped out in the face of government. So then you just see all these other factors kind of occurring too. Beginning of Reconstruction, especially radical Reconstruction, like the biggest leaders. These are the people that rallied these Reconstruction bills: Thaddeus Stevens and Charleston Sumner. Amazing people. If you ever watched that movie Lincoln about the passage of the 13th Amendment, it was like Thaddeus Stevens was played by Tommy Lee Jones, and that guy. You can't. These people need to have. These are the people that we need to have monuments about. These are amazing people, but they both passed away because they were both really old at the time. And then so the radical Republicans lose this powerful leadership. At the same time, the Republican Party, it's not all radical Republicans. That's just one faction of the Republican Party that gained a lot of power during, a short period. The Republican Party, it wasn't this they wanted to, they all opposed slavery. They wanted to abolish slavery, but only a few of them wanted to get rid of white supremacy. A lot of them were advocating against slavery because it was competing against free labor, or it was or it allowed free labor big businesses. They were being funded by a lot of big businesses, and so only a small portion of them were advocates for freedmen and trying to create this egalitarian society. And as they start losing their power and Democrats take over the House, and then they lose their radical Republican leadership, we start seeing less and less power of the radical Republicans, and more of these people that are like, well, basically thought their job was done. Like, we ended slavery, we did our part, much like what Rush Limbaugh and Ben Shapiro says, we did our part, everything's great, white people are okay now, let's just move on. So they had no intention of actually creating this protecting black people and giving them rights. And this is really important because they start turning their back on a lot of black voters. It says, because nearly all black voters supported the Republican ticket in the early election, the party begins to take freedmen's votes for granted and shifted its attention toward courting more moderate white swing voters. If there's ever a line that has to do with what's happening today with the Democrat Party, that's it. I mean, our current Democratic Party just turns their backs on so many black voters because they assume that who else you're going to vote for, and they try so much. They try these moderate issues to try to win white swing voters, but that's for a whole nother day discussion. But I just found that was like such a reality of what's happening today. And at the same time, the North was all about, returning a union, and a lot of them were about abolishing slavery, especially when they start hearing about the realities of slavery the first time through the Civil War. A lot of this was like, they didn't understand, there was an abolition movement trying to, bring attention to it, but a lot of these realities, I mean, a lot of people became abolitionists once they saw what was happening in the South as a soldier, and then, writing about that back to their families. But there was a commitment to end slavery. And there was a lot less commitment to really preserve and white supremacy and provide so the North, you start seeing this apathy in the North, especially one, they thought, hey, we gave, ended slavery and gave them the right to vote. We're good. We've already sacrificed, 350,000 people. What more do we want to do? And another time too, and there was an economic depression in 1873, and it's super expensive, basically, maintaining this black people's rights through military. There's like, military districts, and even after like states, ratified constitutions and ratified 14th and 15th Amendments, all the states are coming back. They're still using the military to protect them, protect black voters, and it's super expensive. And this becomes a huge economic reality when the country experiences a depression in 1873. So North is just like kind of done at this point. They stop voting radical Republicans in the office, and they start looking for more moderate Republicans, or even moderate Democrats at this point. So radical Republicans really start losing the support of their voters at this point. And then there was some real corruption, especially in Grant's administration. There was a lot of corruption. There was some corruption in the Republican Party. There was disaster capitalism. People seeing opportunities. Northern people trying to make money off of rebuilding the South. That definitely happened. I'm not denying that, but there was this massive propaganda effort to really, exaggerate that and demonize and really make, all black politicians and all white allies appear corrupt and incompetent. And like, they came up with these terms, carpetbaggers and scallywags. Carpetbaggers were people from the North coming down and trying to, basically oppress the South, to make a bunch of money. And scallywags were Southern white people that helped these carpetbaggers. And we start seeing all these cartoons, and propaganda about just how horrific they are. And that's where they get this mentality that the whites were all of a sudden the victims of Northern aggression, of Northern oppression, of Republicans and black politicians, and we get these narratives of these black politicians that are just going out, raping white women and like just being horrible at their job, government jobs and stuff like that. And that was not happening at all. But there was all this propaganda, and this propaganda, even like, these happened later, like Gone with the Wind, The Birth of the Nation, all movies that happened in the early 1900s. But they basically told these stories straight through the propaganda, and that really solidifies its ongoing propaganda, where a lot of people still believe that this today, still believe that white people were the victims Southern white people, and then they had to redeem themselves and bring back the glory of the South by basically any means necessary, which meant basically just killing and lynching and terrorizing Black people and any white person that helped Black people. But that really contributed to, because a lot of that propaganda was being pushed to the North, and a lot of people, so that, again, people were just, the North was done at this point. And it really came to a head point in the 1877 election, where it was basically Republican, Hayes versus, man, I'm spacing the Democrat. I think it will come to me, but basically the Democrat president, he's barely winning, with electoral votes, but Hayes is, just behind by a handful. But then there's 5 or 6 states that are all reporting different numbers. There's parts of states are both reporting, going towards one president or other. There's clear corruption, there's clear voter, tampering, and there's a lot of confusion what's happening. So all the Republicans and Democrats get together, and they create what's called the Compromise of 1877, which basically the Democrats are like, we'll let, you have the presidency, we'll let Hayes become the president if you remove the military from the South. And that, Republicans agree to that, and that basically ends any hope of not only it ends radical Reconstruction, but also ends any hope of creating, preserving any kind of civil rights for free Black people at this point, because then that just, allows total terrorism to happen, no consequences, no protection, total voter suppression, and what we see for the next century in the South is basically no Black people are voting. It's all white people voting. Not only is it white people voting, but they also get to use the Black suppressed vote as additional population, for more electoral votes and for more, representation in the House. So not only do we see it in the next century, it's just white domination, white supremacy, but then at the same time, it's just like the 3/5 compromise, using all these Black oppressed bodies to give them even more power over the next century. And they're able to, that's when you see the rise of Dixiecrats, and they're able to stop, up until the 50s and 60s, they're able to stop any legislation that tries to benefit, Black civil rights at this moment in the South. So we call it the solid, Southern bloc at this point, and it's just, it's just the next century of white suppression. Supremacy. James Logan said the tragedy of Reconstruction is not that it failed, but that its successes were curtailed in 1877 and in reverse in 1890. So that's really important to understand, because that is part of the propaganda, is that it failed. It did not fail. It was overthrown by white supremacy. So that's really important to understand. I really like that W. Du Bois writes, the slave went free, stood a brief moment in the sun, and then moved back towards slavery. And that really defines what the next century is going to be about. And we're going to really dive deeply into a lot of these things in the next section, what we call slavery as another name. But basically the South just created, they created new forms of slavery, whether it's sharecropping, Black land theft, youth apprenticeship programs, convict leasing, Black codes, vagrancy laws, and eventually Jim Crow. They created a criminal justice system based on this myth of Black criminality. And that myth, basically allowed them to be as racist and violent as possible. White terrorism, lynching. So they had these myths. This is important to understand, because this is something that we're dealing with still to this day. But when Portugal was invading, Africa, they sold this myth that Black people were these savages and brutal, and they had to be civilized through slavery and Christianity. And then, we didn't want to scare white people, living behind huge plantations of Black people. So then we created these myths that Black people were actually these inferior, docile, subservient people that needed, white people to be, kind of keep them, help, provide for them, and they needed slavery, and they were actually really happy with total, myth. But then after that, after slavery ended, they went back to the African myth of these Black people were violent, because they wanted to use that. They couldn't just do all this. They couldn't just do lynching and terrorism, convict leasing, sharecropping, without some kind of justification. And their justification was that these were Black criminals, and we had to be, we had to meet with them, we had to protect ourselves, including white women, with violence, whether that's KKK, whether that's police. That this is where the foundations of policing came about, and this anti-Blackness in our policing institutions that we never actually have confronted, to this day. And we see, voter suppression, like we had to suppress their votes because, they were, because when they had that brief moment when they were, radical Reconstruction, it was just so awful. And then, so it's all these lies and these myths, but these caught on, and we're basically, I mean, these all these myths are still ingrained, even though a lot of these systems are gone. A lot of these myths are still ingrained with us today. This a myth of Black criminality, and even a myth of the Jezebel of Black woman, because at this period we saw, for the next century, we saw rampant, rape, white people raping Black women, and they're still pushing this Jezebel stereotype that it was really their fault, because they were so, sexualized. And in fact, the civil rights movements in the 50s and 60s, was started from anti, rape movements. Like Rosa Parks, was hired by the NAACP to start, anti-rape movements in the South. And and when Montgomery, Alabama came, the bus boycott came, they tapped into these anti-sexual violence, NAACP, movements, women movements. And that was really the foundation of the 60s civil rights movements, was this movement against basically white people raping Black women. So it's and then, and it also ended, any idea of land redistribution, slave reparations, any of this stuff, it completely ended. And for the next century, we just have, white supremacy. If you want to learn more about Reconstruction, there's actually this great documentary that was just released last year. It was done by Henry Louis Gates Jr., who does that that celebrity ancestry show. I can't remember the name of it, but he's actually, he's a Harvard professor, a doctor, who's written multiple books about Reconstruction, and he organized this. I think it's like a 4-part series on Reconstruction, and it's just. It's I wish I could require everyone to watch it. It's such an important time period, and he does such a great job kind of capturing that time period. So definitely recommend check out PBS documentary series on Reconstruction. Can't say enough amazing things about it. And it's important to understand that we research it because right now, there's a lot of false narratives around Reconstruction, and that's, a lot of part because it's such an important, pivotal moment in our history where we could have gone, our country could have gone in two different directions. It could have gone into, creating a more egalitarian, equal society and fixing the past harms, that slavery caused, or we could have gone, more towards, let's preserve white supremacy and just whitewash everything that happened. Unfortunately, we went with the latter, and that's, because, we're going to talk about this in the next class about whitewashing history, but it's because a lot of our historians are really focused on these, this like white, the white perspective and a white, propaganda perspective about a lot of these narratives, especially, with the rise of the lost cause of the Confederacy, which is this whole movement that happened, started happening, way beyond the civil rights movement or beyond Civil War. It was like happening, during the early 1900s up to the civil rights movement, was this push of rewriting the history of Civil War to like kind of downplaying that, slavery wasn't that bad, but, slaves actually were pretty happy, and and that the Civil War was fought for states' rights, and it was actually a war of Northern oppression. So and that's where we see all those statues that we see nowadays, the Confederate generals and stuff. Is that was a concerted effort to push this narrative that basically whitewashed the history, all the bad things that the South had done during slavery and during the Civil War. So that's where we get so that's where we get these narratives that such as like Reconstruction was a failure. And I'm guilty of this in last year's class when I taught about Reconstruction. I titled it the failure of Reconstruction. It's just it's just how people describe Reconstruction, that it failed. In reality, it didn't fail. It was a very successful government. It had passed an enormous amount of amazing legislation. Some of the most important legislation we have today around civil rights was passed during Reconstruction. The South during radical Reconstruction was probably the most equal, especially when it comes to Black representation. That it was it was probably the most equal the South has ever been, including to this day. and they did an enormous amount of good from, they created the public, the South's first public education system for both, white and black, children. And they created all kinds of great things. I mean, it was a very successful, government, and that was overthrown by white supremacy. But we talk about this different way. We talk about carpetbaggers and scallywags. Carpetbaggers. We have these narratives. This is of these people from the North. Carpetbaggers coming in and just like oppressing the South, and so the whole Redeemer movement, the white supremacist movement, that involves terrorism and voter suppression, was actually this good movement that freed them from these evil carpetbaggers and these scalawags, where white Southerners, they're collaborating with carpetbaggers. And yeah, I mean, there was definitely, anytime there's a war afterwards, there's definitely disaster capitalism. There's definitely, capitalists trying to, get rich off the, rebuilding it. It's definitely corruption. So that did happen, but that was, not a representation, an accurate representation of the Reconstruction era. That was, that was a small part of what was going on, and a majority of it was a very successful and important government that was overthrown. So that's important that we talk about Reconstruction was overthrown by white supremacy. It didn't fail. I'm going to read this quote by another 1916 author. He writes, for decades, a group of white historians known as the Dunning School, after Columbia University historians William Archibald Dunning, portrayed Reconstruction as a tragic period, in his words, the scandalous misrule of carpetbaggers and Negroes, brought on by misguided enfranchisement of black men. As a historian, Eric Foner has written, the Dunning School and his interpretation of Reconstruction helped provide moral and historical cover for the Jim Crow system. In Black Reconstruction in America, W.E.B. Du Bois challenged the consensus of white historians who ascribed the faults and failures of Reconstruction to Negro ignorance and corruption, and offered what is now considered a more reliable account of the era as an imperfect but noble effort to build a multiracial, democracy in the South. And that really comes out, W. Du Bois, wrote the Reconstruction in America in the early 1900s, and this was like the first book that really challenged this white, propaganda perspective that, Reconstruction failed because of ignorance and corruption, and just, black people were just unable to, figure out how to rule themselves. And that really, again was, pushed, to kind of justify, the return to white supremacy, to Jim Crow, terrorism, lynching, and all these things. But that was like the narrative for a while, until, W. Du Bois was one of the first what we call radical historians, or people historians that challenged that, and actually showed that the complete opposite of that. And and that's why, I mean, in another great account, if you really want to dive into the history of Reconstruction, this is a fantastic book to read. And the other false narrative that emerged, and we're going to talk more about this in the next couple of sections as we talk about lynching and the convict leasing and things like that, is they created this idea of this false narrative of black criminality, that blacks were just naturally criminals. And we talk about this a lot in other sections, but it was when Portugal overcame, or when Portugal started the slave trade to justify what they were doing, making a whole enormous amount of wealth from this like horrific system. They created this idea that black people were dangerous and savages and uncivilized, and we were actually doing them a favor by bringing, enslaving them and bringing them civilization and Christianity. But then, when all the slave, when all the enslaved people, were in America, to kind of calm people down about having all these dangerous people working for us, they created this idea, as other myth, that these stereotypes of black people were docile and simple, and they needed the guidance and the over management of white people. So but then once slavery was ended, we went back to that black brute, the black dangerous black criminal, and that and we used that that's justification to push through your racist criminal justice systems, police violence, lynching, Jim Crow, all these horrific things that ultimately was done so white supremacy, we could bring back white supremacy, and we could continue making an enormous amount of wealth off of exploited black people. But we reframed it as these black people were so dangerous, we had to do this. for our own safety, and rather than for the fact that we just want to continue getting rich off of their exploitation. And that black criminality myth is something that's still ingrained with us today. We still see this. Portrayed, in police violence and police brutality, and just our internal bias and racial bias towards Black people. And then, and a lot of things we talk about, like Gone with the Wind and all these other movies, kind of, attached onto these bad narratives. And if you ever watched Gone with the Wind, I never actually watched it, to be honest, but I read that summary, and it's pretty horrific. About this portrayal of just like all the white people were just as victims of these like rapist Black people that took during Reconstruction, that just killed and raped freely, and did all these horrible things. In reality, none of that really happened. But so that's definitely it's a propaganda piece, Gone with the Wind. I'm going to play this quick. Another propaganda piece was The Birth of a Nation, and we're going to talk a little bit more about this later during lynching, because it did a lot to kind of bring back the KKK, but it was just this horrific piece of propaganda that D.W. Griffin's created, and it was like in two sections, and in one section was about this a propaganda piece of all these white people black facing and dressing up like Black people during Reconstruction, and then basically just doing all kinds of and they're too simple, it just showed them as being unable to govern themselves, and then constantly going around raping and killing. And this was because it was such and when we talk about movies, this was such an important piece, because it was like the first movie that that I guess it was it was a really good it was a really technology speaking, it was a very advanced movie for the time being. So a lot of people gave it a lot of praise for that. But at the same time, a lot of racist people like Woodrow Wilson, who was a white supremacist who believed in segregationists, talked about how this was. He said it's like writing history with lightning. My only regret is that it's also terribly true. So I'm just going to play a little clip of just what he thought was terribly true. So that's just a little clip of. I mean, I think the whole movie was like 3 hours long. It was just basically. I mean, it was awful. I mean, just showing that black people, were just, black legislators were just getting drunk and not, couldn't wear shoes and eating chicken while trying to pass laws that basically, and then they put the whole, fear of protecting white women and black rapists, kind of myth into this that, they're more focused on, intermarriages and trying to, black people trying to get married, which, yeah, I was, I mean, normally it's not, in reality, it wasn't, it was actually a good thing, intermarriage, but white people back then were able to use that to really scare a lot of other white people. That was a big thing about protecting the sanctity of white women because white women kind of represented white supremacy and whiteness. And so you can just see, I mean, it was just a horrible propaganda piece, but at the same time, this was kind of like the first big, movie of our country. And, everyone, even including the president, was watching this. And lots of people who had, no contact with the South, all over the country saw this and thought this was what, was actually happening.